Well, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the 35th conference of the Society. And our theme is the Fair Work Act, which is a pretty predictable theme, but the real theme is the second part of the title, the Australian idiosyncrasy, for which we are indebted to the Productivity Commission itself. That's its description of the largest part of the Fair Work Act. Before I give an introduction, I'll just give you the apologies. First, a distinguished apology. Alex Robson can't be here, and the reason is that he is now a senior economic advisor to the Prime Minister.
No excuse.
Yeah. Next, Hugh Morgan is an apology. The Australian Public Service Commissioner John Lloyd also, David Russell, Richard Colbatch, and the Minister for Employment, Senator Michaela Cash. Now, the major theme of this conference is two industrial relations inquiries, that of the Productivity Commission into the IR system itself, and that of Royal Commissioner Hayden into trade union governance and corruption. And the conference is also about the stalled deregulation of coastal shipping. Second theme is quite special but relevant, and that is the United States response to union and other types of corruption, namely the Racketeering, Influenced and Corrupt Organisations Act, and the place for such a measure in Australia. And then thirdly, there will be a review of the writings of my illustrious predecessor, Ray Evans. And there will also be a review of some of the decisions of the unillustrious Fair Work Commission. Now, Scott Barklam will talk about the draft Productivity Commission report. I'd like to give you some background to that. It's not necessary to have a big inquiry to know what to do about industrial relations. Thus, this Productivity Commission inquiry, I think, has been a poor sign of the government's competence in this field. Coastal shipping presents a similar problem. Coastal shipping has almost disappeared in Australia under heavy and rorted regulation in recent years. It should be apparent that immediate change is needed. There are senators who are holding up coastal shipping deregulation. Again, I think that shows incompetence and, in this case, disregard for seafaring employment and the coastal shipping industry. Contrast the Society. You know that our starting point is the principle of freedom of employment, and the Society has given concrete expression to this in 6 matters. Terms of employment to only relate to employment matters. Employment agreements to be binding. Unfair dismissal jurisdiction to be reined in. Employees to be able to choose their union freely. Restore the ABCC. And on transfer of a business, allow new employers to apply their own industrial terms to the incoming employees. These are all matters that have popular and business support. You don't need a 2-year inquiry to implement them. If someone like Tony Shepherd or Martin Ferguson speaks in support of these sorts of changes, and they have, you know, if you are the Prime Minister or the Minister for Employment, that you have to listen and act. What is required is for these ministers to speak up. Now, this is not what has happened. For under Prime Minister Abbott, debate on IR was frozen. Now, this may change under his successor, although you'll recall a contrary sign. Just a couple of months ago, Resources Minister Frydenberg spoke up on the need for cutting penalty rates on Sunday and to re-examine industrial issues, and he was immediately told to keep quiet by the Treasurer, no less. But it is encouraging that the new Minister for Employment, Senator Michaela Cash, has an object of, as she puts it, minimum government interference, which aligns well with our own objective and the 6 measures I've just mentioned. It's also gratifying that she has actually practiced in IR in a leading firm. Another welcome change under Prime Minister Turnbull is Kelly O'Dwyer, a member of this society, becoming Assistant Treasurer and Minister for Small Business, 2 portfolios which provide a practical setting for the changes that we advocate. A final good sign is that the Prime Minister has been reported as wanting to rebuild relations with the crossbench senators, and that might undo this roadblock in the Senate to coastal shipping deregulation. Now, a further issue is the quality of the debate on IR in Australia. We actually want to encourage debate as a society, but outside the predictable pronouncements of unions and employer bodies, there is almost no such debate in Australia, and the staleness of the debate does not help new thinking. But this is what we've done about it. Earlier this year, the Society brought to Australia Professor Bernd Fitzenberger, then of Freiburg University, who has been described as one of the top 10 economists in Germany, to speak on the German system of industrial relations and its contribution to high employment in and the international competitiveness of that country. He and his co-authors, in an earlier paper, attributed the German system of IR to transforming Germany from what they called the sick man of Europe some years after German reunification to what they said was the economic superstar that it is of the last decade. And this is how we used Professor Fitzenberger's talents. We put him on a tour around Australia. In Sydney, he spoke at DLA Piper. In Canberra, he addressed the National Press Club. He met Employment Minister Abetz, senior officers of his department, and the Chief Executive of ACCI, Kate Carnell. In Melbourne, we were lucky to co-host him with Professor Michael Porter of Deakin University. He also addressed a dinner here. And in Perth, he gave another talk and there was another dinner. This is the biggest speaking tour the Society has ever organised. No one else does this in Australia in the field of IR. Yet it is obvious that the universal Australian desire for an export-oriented and competitive economy requires a look at the industrial relations as well as other aspects of countries that have got such an economy. Professor Mark Wooden of the Melbourne Institute of Applied Economics spoke favourably of the German experience only the other day in the Australian newspaper and referred favourably to the paper that Professor Fitzenberger had co-authored. Now his views, Wooden's views, were extensively promoted as part of the economic conference that followed his pronouncements and in the Australian newspaper. This is some confirmation that there is an audience for the views of the Society, and I hope in the future that we also can generate this kind of publicity, but it's going to be hard work. Now, can I say something on the Productivity Commission inquiry, because it's not obvious why there should be such an inquiry. If you have an inquiry, which was the policy of the Liberals before the election, the inquiry should address actual problems. These are the problems, and there's public disquiet about them. Go-away money, greenfields agreements, decaying investment, rigidity of awards, extortion in the building industry, incompetence of the Fair Work Commission, the Health Services Union not serving its members, the decline in the unions, Australia having the highest minimum wage in the world, and so on. Now, last year, on the 19th of December, the government directed the Productivity Commission to hold its inquiry into what it said was the performance of the workplace relations framework. Almost none of the issues I've just mentioned were put before the Commission to examine. This is mind-boggling. The Commission could have been asked, for example, to examine the performance of the Fair Work Commission, which is a very practical task. Instead, it was directed to examine the performance of, quotes, a framework. What on earth is that? Now, the Commission was also expected to link this framework to what was called well-being, productivity and competitiveness. But why bother? For we know that there are so many factors that influence well-being, productivity and competitiveness. You can't single out IR. An example of that very problem is actually in the United States, where it's been pointed out that prime-aged men are not able to compete with younger men for jobs. Now, why is that? I don't know the answer, but it shows there are many factors at work, not just in the United States case, the labour market. Now, the Commission was also asked to examine the impact of this framework on what was said to be the ability of business and the labour market to respond appropriately to changing economic conditions. But if you look at the last decade, in iron ore, coal and grain, there's been a boom. No workplace system really has stood in the way. I think the problem is that the questions for the Commission were put too broadly. It should have been limited to examination of whether IR played a role in businesses failing or losing export markets. Furthermore, I doubt that actual employers and actual employees could care at all about these very broad issues. And if they don't care, why should the rest of us? Now, so I think broadly, the government has burdened the Productivity Commission with a task, with the wrong task, with the wrong questions. Now, a further reason why this Commission, I think, is not the appropriate body to look at IR is that it's not used to getting evidence. The Productivity Commission's habits are academic, adjudicative and macro, and those habits are confirmed in the draft report which came out in August. The Commission does have the power to actually summons witnesses and have evidence and documents produced to it, but it doesn't much use those powers. An illustration of this approach of the Commission is on the subject of unfair dismissal. Now, the Fair Work Commission has given numerous unfair dismissal decisions, and if you wanted to know how it's working, you would analyse the decisions. But no, the Commission relied on the views of legal centres and lobbyists, and on one academic. It looked at 3 unfair dismissal cases, but not directly, but on somebody else's summary of those cases. I think this creates a weak basis for recommendations. Furthermore, the Commission, I don't think, has properly looked at the issue of competitiveness, even though it was expressly directed to do so by the terms of reference. In fact, what it did look at on the subject of competitiveness was worker dismissal arrangements. Now, that's a very small aspect of say, the way a multinational company looks at choosing between Australia and another country. The Commission was asked to look at other industrial relations systems. Now, the Commission's got money and it can commission experts to look at things. It could have commissioned experts in other countries to tell us the system in, say, Italy or the United States or somewhere else. But this is what it did. It took a summary of the features of other systems from a 5-year-old textbook. that's risky. The Commission also looked at Germany, and it said this in the case of Germany. And remember, we know about Germany. Terms and conditions are mainly regulated by statute. It said that collective agreements or works agreements are also regulate works terms and conditions. It said that employment contracts must comply with these arrangements, and there is little scope for individual arrangement except for senior managers. Now, everything it said there is the opposite of what Professor Bernd Fitzenberger said in his national tour. His thrust of his points were that change occurs at the firm level. It's no longer a big industry unions arrangement. And the reason the German economy has been flexible is that at individual firms, workers have made agreements with the managers. And as he points out, Professor Fitzenberger, there is no legislated minimum wage, or there hasn't been one until very recently. Now, the measure of the German system is apparent in such statistics as Germany having the lowest unit labour costs among its trading partners. Just by comparison, Australia has the highest unit labour costs. Germany has a 5% unemployment rate, and it has very low youth unemployment. So, on the key comparison with Germany, the Commission, I think, inadequately made the comparison and misleadingly made the comparison. The subject of migrants is worth looking at. Migrants are in the news. Now, first, the Commission in its draft report pointed out that there are some overlapping inquiries, one by the Fair Work Ombudsman and one by the Senate. They're going on now. Now, if there are two other inquiries going on, why would you have a third one? It's not apparent, and the Commission had plenty to do on other topics. It could have said, quite reasonably, we'll leave this area for the others. However, the Commission waded into migrants. Again, it relied on lobbyists to say that, surprise, surprise, migrants are vulnerable to exploitation. But what is not common knowledge is the scale of exploitation of migrants. And recently it fell on Fairfax Media and the ABC to uncover wage abuse or exploitation of workers at 7-Eleven, a problem that that company has admitted and is trying to rectify, and in fact the head of the company has been replaced as a result. Now, if mere media can uncover migrant exploitation, why did not the Productivity Commission do so, with its panoply of powers and resources? Now, one of the recommendations from the Commission on the subject of migrants is that penalties on employers should be increased. But it didn't look at any actual penalties. It didn't determine that they were inadequate. It relied again on the submission of one academic for that conclusion. And this is perhaps the most serious point. There are massive migrations underway around the world. It has been observed that Germany is taking in hundreds of thousands, it's probably 1 million, of Syrians and others, will create a labour supply shock in that country and cause wages there to fall in that country in the long run. Now, that again may help Germany's competitiveness, but it's an aspect of the migration phenomenon which would have been within the expertise of the Productivity Commission to examine. It missed the opportunity. The final point about the Commission's report is that it is 985 pages long. Now, this is forbidding for most readers, but especially for workers and employers. Who knows what other inaccuracies are in the draft report? Who knows what gems are in the draft report, if only one had the time and energy to read it all. Compare this. Some of you will recall that after the Trade Practices Act had been running a few years. There was a review under the Fraser government of its effectiveness and how it needed to be changed. That review was done in 100 pages in the matter of a few months, and almost everything in the review was put into effect. So, in short, the Productivity Commission has been launched into an investigation of the industrial IR system with waffling terms of reference, resulting in an inquiry for which it was ill-equipped and resulting in an overlong and defective report. Whose failure is this? In my view, it's the Abbott government. It showed a government telling you what was good for you. It gives a clue as to the fall of Tony Abbott. The problems are now for the Turnbull government to rectify. The future. The Society, based on our experience this year, will need to address the problem of publicising the debate that it is encouraging. So in the coming year, we will look at how best that debate should be continued and initiated, including by holding functions in different parts of Australia.